Good morning, everyone. The title of my talk is There's No Going Back Now, Fairness and Justice in the New Language Testing Landscape. Before we get started, a brief outline since we'll be covering quite a bit of ground. I'll start off by setting the stage. Clearly, there have been some big changes in the world and in language testing, and I'll kind of recap those as I've seen it unfold. Next, I'll touch briefly on validity, but that's not going to be the focus of the talk today. I'll be spending most of my time talking about fairness and justice, and in particular, some areas that I see as new or re-emerging concerns as we move to increasingly online test delivery. And finally, I'll close with a few thoughts about looking forward. So first, it goes without saying, COVID-19 has been a watershed event kind of for humanity in general, but also that would include high-stakes testing as well. And as I've been watching all of this unfold, I've noticed some differences between language testing and other forms of high-stakes testing. So with other high-stakes tests, thinking about things used for example, university admissions, we've seen kind of a mixed bag, more cancellations than pivots to online delivery. Stakeholders and institutions that use tests were able to make decisions using other pieces of evidence, thinking about university admissions, just looking at GPA, letters of recommendation, other forms of, academic or other evidence pertaining to academic capabilities. Leading up, this definitely predated COVID, but there was a growing movement in the United States to move away from tests like the SAT and the GRE in higher education admissions. And that's sort of accompanied by resistance to standardized testing in K-12. And so now we're seeing there are well over 1,000 or so universities in the United States that do not use standardized academic achievement tests in admissions. On the other hand, in language testing, we saw an extremely rapid pivot to at-home delivery, particularly for tests, high-stakes tests of English, a little bit less for others, but there were some examples too of languages like French and some foreign languages in the United States making offerings available at home. And I think we're seeing some continued movement in that direction. I think there's another talk today involving test staff. The way I see this, though, the reason why there had to be a pivot to at-home deliveries, because in many cases where language abilities are relevant to decision making, there is little or no other evidence available or other evidence practically obtainable. So there aren't, quick and easy workarounds like statements of purpose or transcripts where we have a lot of confidence in their evidentiary capacity as indicators of language ability. And then alternatives like one-on-one interviews conducted by institutions were just apparently beyond the capabilities of institutions. And so what we're kind of seeing, I think, moving out of this is maybe a recognition that in many high-stakes decisions contexts, like higher education admissions, language test scores are maybe not skippable or not easily replaceable. And so the way I see it, we're in sort of a new normal now. And what I'm seeing as the new normal in particular is variety. So that's increased accessibility, flexibility, options in language testing. For some of the same decisions that we had to make before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and now we're not out of the woods yet, but as we move beyond the pandemic, are going to be made with a wider variety of evidentiary options, i.e. test scores from many different tests. And I think another really important component of this new normal, this new landscape, is security. Security has certainly jumped to the forefront of the concerns of many stakeholders and language testers alike. And this is where things I think have really expanded considerably. Not that there were no technical concerns before with security, but we sort of, pre-COVID could rely at test centers on more of a physical control model, control the space, and control malpractice. Whereas now we've seen the sort of propagation of this technological panopticon where people are being monitored, their computers are being monitored while they take tests. So I have a few predictions and premises that are going to underlie this talk. The first is that computerized delivery of high-stakes language tests is now the standard. Most of the field is computerized delivery. High-stakes language tests also do not seem to be going away. If there was any opportunity to stop requiring TOEFL and IELTS or similar test scores in university admissions, COVID was it. Similarly, we saw this quick pivot to at-home remotely proctored language tests, and I think that cat is out of the bag. This doesn't seem to be temporary. I don't think we'll be able to stop completely giving at-home language tests, remotely proctored tests. And then finally, this is, again, I think just a continuation of a trend, maybe one accelerated by COVID, but we're going to see, going forward, multiple language tests being used for the same high-stakes decisions. And to kind of illustrate how this is all playing out, so around 2010, your university may have been accepting one test or two, TOEFL or IELTS, right? The TOEFL PBT was, on its way out, although kind of accepted for legacy reasons and to accommodate test takers in certain parts of the world who had limited access to test centers with computers. But by about 5 years later, the TOEFL IBT had certainly, continued to be the flagship product for ETS, IELTS going strong, and we saw the emergence of some new players like the PTE Academic and the Duolingo English test. And then COVID hit, so that's our red line in the middle. Things kind of shifted noticeably in 2019, 2020. The TOEFL IBT had to be paused in many locations, so instead people could take the TOEFL special home edition, now just the home edition. IELTS similarly had to pause administration in many places throughout the world at various times, and so the IELTS indicator came into the picture, and Duolingo's footprint expanded. And now it's 2021. What we're starting to see is, different levels of capacity for managing, or some countries even getting past the worst of the pandemic. And so now universities are faced with more evidentiary options for English proficiency than ever before. There are people taking the TOEFL in test centers. There's people continuing to take the TOEFL at home. Soon there are going to be people submitting TOEFL essential scores. So you can see now that there are so many options available, and I think this is beyond what anybody might have imagined about 5 or so years ago. So a brief note here about validity and validation. Clearly, the language testing community, researchers like those of you watching this talk right now, this is our bread and butter, and this is maybe what we're best at. And if we're not necessarily ahead of the curve when it comes to validity and validation, in the face of changes like COVID has brought, we at least seem to do an okay job at keeping up to speed. So if you take a argument-based approach to validity and sort of look at how we've been handling the increased computerization of tests over the years, you can see that we've been doing, I think, good research and mapping it onto key inferences in test interpretation and use arguments. And you can see everything from how well people keyboard and does that impact test scores to what is the new digital learning environment. And then most recently, I'll point out, how consistent are scores and score distributions across at-home and test center administrations. We've seen some really cutting-edge stuff from psychometricians affiliated with Paragon, which offers the Canadian Academic English Language Exam, and the folks at ETS. So again, keeping up with the times fairly well. Now, where I see us a little bit less prepared to grapple with the new language testing landscape is in the areas of fairness and justice. This is something that we all should care about, that many large test providers, high-stakes test providers purport to care about, and I think genuinely do. You can see a couple pictures here. Duolingo's got a new slogan, Transforming Testing for Good. ETS in their mission statement is very explicit about equity and fairness. So to break this down a little bit, fairness and justice, although I don't think we quite devote enough attention to these issues, we do at least have some good tools, some good frameworks for thinking about them. So fairness, here's the idea, we're treating everybody equally in the context of the test. So administering the test scores, using the test, and so forth. Fairness, to be fair, is something that I think we are maybe doing a little bit better with at the moment, just because, again, we talk about fairness, validity, and justice using separate words, but they are inextricable. Many aspects of validity, for example, related to generalization, related to the explanation of test scores, right? Construct relevant and irrelevant variance. Those are issues very much relevant to fairness. On the other hand, justice is I think, where we're even further behind. So justice, as we understand it from thinkers like Shohami, Kunnan, McNamara et al., is primarily concerned with the way we use tests to enact policy, or how policy dictates that tests are used. So this gets us a little bit beyond a test itself, and we have to deal with other stakeholders. So we have to kind of look outside our nice, neat, language testing field here, and think about the way test scores are used more broadly throughout society, throughout institutions. And so I notice here that often when we're thinking about even justice, we are still often focused on one test. So I want to question that, and I'll develop this idea over the next couple of slides. In Kunnan's framework, fairness involves opportunity to acquire the knowledge, skills, or abilities needed for a test, being consistent across test takers in terms of interpretation, free of bias for test takers, particularly avoiding construct-relevant variance, and appropriate access to testing as a service, administration, standard-setting procedures to make sure that decision-making is equitable as well. Justice here is, bringing about benefits in society, particularly, I think, for test takers, people in that test-taking community, but also for other stakeholders who are impacted by a test. And here, I appreciate that Kunnan is transparent about the importance of values. So values are certainly subjective. We can argue for universals, but ultimately it is an argument, and that conversation, that debate needs to happen through public reasoning. So I'll note here in Kunnan's framework, we're talking about tests in the singular, an assessment, a test. What I've tried to illustrate so far is that actually when we use tests, so test policy, tests being used by institutions, it's often tests in the plural. And that creates some conditions that I think, again, we'll need to grapple with more seriously. So now I'm going to move on to talk about some new or emerging or re-emerging concerns as we've moved to increasingly computerized, increasingly remote delivery of high-stakes tests. The first among those is public health. And this one, honestly, is pretty straightforward. Compared to how we used to do things, typically, where we cram a whole bunch of people into a room to take a test, that's a no-go during a respiratory virus pandemic. That is something we cannot justify. That would be doing harm to a lot of people, particularly those who are immunocompromised or otherwise at risk. Thinking a little more narrowly, and maybe this is somewhat of a fairness issue, masks, right? Now we know enough about the COVID pandemic to realize that masks are one of the most effective tools we have in fighting it. So if you're going to bring people into a test center, they should probably keep their masks on if they are in a room with other people. How does that impact, for example, speaking performance? These are new considerations. It was never really on our radar before. What if people had to wear masks? And then last, and some people have described COVID as a once-in-a-century pandemic, sort of this century's Spanish flu. But there is, I think, not too alarmist of reason to be concerned that things actually could get worse going forward. This, due to climate change, due to the expanding human population, we might run into pandemics more frequently than we have in the past. And so, I'm curious how things are going to develop. Maybe there are some lessons we could have learned from SARS, MERS, swine flu when it comes to testing. So public health, again, before COVID, I don't know that this is really on our radar. Some new concerns in terms of justice, what sort of benefits can be yielded by requiring testing during a public health crisis. Are we promoting public health and safety? So what sort of values, what sort of benefits are we trying to create through our testing policy? And then as the fairness matter, we're thinking about some people having to take it in a test center, some people being able to take it at home. Is there some bias for or against somebody who has to wear a mask or not? The next issue, security, proctoring, and privacy. And I think this is sort of the elephant in the room, or has been throughout higher stakes testing and assessment since the get-go. Now, security, even though it's come to the forefront of our attention, is certainly not a new concern in high stakes testing. We can look back to much lower tech eras, people manipulating the time zone differences. One of my favorite stories from this, and I think it kind of hits all my bullet points, somebody was hired to take the TOEFL in New York, try to remember all the answers for that particular form given on that day, etch them into a pencil, fly to New York, fly to Los Angeles and give that to somebody who's going to take the test in a 3-hour time zone difference on the same day. So this kind of cheating potentially is still something, we keep on our radars, but now we have new things. So as remote proctoring has become incredibly prevalent throughout education, not just high stakes assessment, but lower stakes, we've collected a lot of anecdotes. I'm sure there's been a lot of internal investigations by testing companies and proctoring companies to figure out what people have been doing to subvert security. Things like, when you have to show your environment when you are getting checked into the test, if you can keep some sort of unofficial, unsanctioned aid hidden the entire time through point of view tricks, that's something you can do that wasn't really a thing back in test centers. Hardware tricks. I read an article coming out of Vice magazine talking about how kids in the dorm rooms in the United States were hooking up 20-foot HDMI cords from one laptop to another so that somebody could see a test that was being securely proctored in another room. There's also software tricks. Hacking is now a renewed concern. So there are tons of countermeasures in place or that have been put into place over the last year or two. And perhaps what has captured most of our attention is proctoring related. So folks being watched by humans at the other end of a webcam, and also AI systems, visual AIs, and then also AIs that monitor computer processes. So this has raised a number of ethical concerns ranging from fairness in terms of equitable access to technology, not being biased against during while being monitored for malpractice, and a host of others. Privacy, accountability, who's doing the proctoring? I think that's a good question. More recent developments, some of this just keeps my head spinning. Initially, there were outfits offering AI-only proctoring. So, the machine can do it all for us. It will flag suspicious activity. Turns out that doesn't work so well, in particular because the AI systems are crude. They flag behaviors that are maybe not really indicative of cheating at all. And we've also uncovered, and this has been known for some time now, that AI has many blind spot systematic bias, particularly along racial lines. So people who are of darker complexions tend to not be served as well by AI systems. And in some cases, they're having trouble just doing the basic check-in procedures to verify that there's a face on the screen, for example, because of darker complexions. People getting incredibly frustrated in some cases. And so this is clearly a problem. So now pretty much all major players in remote proctoring are requiring some sort of human involvement in the proctoring process. There are also new challenges in cybersecurity. Clearly, somebody's laptop in their bedroom is under much less control. There's much more vulnerabilities than computers in a secure testing center. Test providers have started to realize this is something they need to be talking about. Duolingo put out a blog post sort of chronicling or reporting on some of their recent ethical hacking efforts to sort of uncover and guard against hacking attempts, breaches of security. And this is wonderful, but of course the catch-22 with security is you can't say exactly what was found or how people broke through, because then you kind of let out all the secrets. On the other hand, in terms of justice, how can we publicly reason about the security of a test when we don't know exactly how secure it is independently of a test provider? So excellent concerns, classic test center stuff, but the new concerns, who's doing the proctoring? Are they really invested? Are people with more resources more able to cheat, more technological resources in particular? Are test takers' privacy being protected? And is there going to be systematic bias in monitoring in security protocols? The next issue is access, and I see that as strongly connected to internet and communications technology. Many of us have experienced this firsthand over the past couple of years working from home. We've seen that being able to do things remotely can increase access, improving conditions for people with disability, other health conditions, elder care responsibilities, being located in a rural area. There's a lot of potential good stuff going on. Relatedly, I think technology is finally reducing test fees. You can see here, tests like the TOEFL and the IELTS are rather expensive. It also costs money for additional score reports. On the other hand, Duolingo came in lowballing it, a very competitive price point. TOEFL Essentials is following that, and both seem to offer no fee score reporting. And even the IELTS indicator was a little bit of a discount compared to the in-person IELTS. So this can be seen as increasing, economic access to testing. Again, ostensibly quite a good thing. And to sort of wrap this all up in an anecdote, what does this mean? Like, who are we now able to serve better with remote testing and more economically accessible testing? There was a article in the Chronicle of Higher Education called "Escaping Oblivion" that describes a story of Neil Deng, who is a refugee from Africa. He was working with some college advisors because he's a very promising young man who thought he could forge a future for himself first by getting educated overseas. And he managed to get a fee waiver to take the DET and did very well. And this caught the attention of college advisors. He started setting his sights on some American institutions and also the Netherlands, other institutions, but these were places that required TOEFL scores. Deng was making $110 a month in Ethiopia. So economically, this was out of bounds for him. But he eventually found his way. I think he's currently studying in Canada right now. So technology, again, we see a lot of potential to do good here, to increase the justice, I would say, to promote more benefits for more people. On the other hand, though, we don't want to be overly optimistic. Stable, high-speed internet can be burdensome cost-wise, might not be available. Adequate hardware is a cost. Luckily, you don't need too sophisticated of a machine to run an at-home test, but you do need a machine, a laptop type of machine. And in some places around the world, stable electricity is something that should not be taken for granted. So an example here, there's a blog post on Medium from a Miss Yusra Saheed in Pakistan who describes her experience taking the IELTS indicator. She's obviously a very motivated, very well-prepared individual. She knew about brownouts in her locale, and so she got a wireless internet device, stocked up on data so she wouldn't run out in the middle of the exam, and was able to successfully take the test. But think about all the extra preparation that somebody in Ms. Saheed's situation would have to account for in order to successfully take an at-home test. Similarly, in even countries we consider to be developed, 11% of high schoolers in the United States have unpredictable or terrible home internet. Smartphones and laptops are among the most common computing devices at home, rather than desktops. But I'll note here, smartphones are typically not serviceable for taking at-home language tests. This becomes really critical when you look at the most disadvantaged test takers. If they only have one internet-enabled device at home, they are more likely for that device to be a smartphone, meaning they cannot take most high-stakes exams at home. So all of this, when it comes to at-home testing, the increased access, different, facilities, affordances people have in terms of internet access to in-person test centers, all of that, we're getting to the situation where we have unstandardized settings and conditions for taking an exam. And of course, the concern from language testing is how does this variation potentially impact test scores, score interpretations. But I want to step back and actually think a little bit more about how does the variation of at-home administration compare to the variation actually in test centers. So clearly there's some circumstances at home that are not great from the perspective of standardization. This is from a South Korean test prep message board. This is just a brief little story. Somebody was in the middle of their listening section. Their cat managed to open their bedroom door, walk in, and that left them flustered for the rest of the listening section, unfortunately. A cute but somewhat tragic story. On the other hand, though, we might assume that standardized tests given at test centers are administered in a standardized fashion, but if you browse around, you'll find that at least from the test taker perspective, there are differences in quality across many test centers. So in this same forum, the same website, you can see people asking for recommendations. What are the better test centers to go to? And then you can look at ratings for individual test centers and see that, some places get low marks because it's kind of noisy. In some cases, people's interest may be best served. They may have the best test-taking conditions by actually taking it home, if they can at least cat-proof their doors. And then, thinking a little bit more broadly, a little bit less flippantly, perhaps, about unintended consequences. So I don't want to be an obnoxious devil's advocate and say, well, actually, increased access to testing is a bad thing. But there could be some things we just didn't plan on happening. So again, these concerns, moving from, are the testing conditions fair at the test center? Are scores being assigned fairly? Now our new concerns, are financial concerns influencing choices in taking a test? Are we making undue assumptions about accessibility? Just because we throw it online, does that mean we've really increased access for everyone? And I think related to that, something we should keep an eye out for, are test providers going to be trying to reduce their number of in-person test centers just because the argument being, well, people can take it at home now. Do all those people, do they have a computer at home with stable internet access? That's something we're not so sure of at this point. And the last major area I want to touch on here, and I think this brings it back to, many of the core concerns of language testers, constructs, but also the way we're using tests, decisions. And I want to talk about how we compare these. This goes beyond the scope of a single test. So to be very crude here, to paint with broad brushes, many mainstream tests, high-stakes language tests, particularly those used in admissions, sort of rely on communicatively oriented constructs and academic or other domain definitions. In English, to use common examples, we're talking about the IELTS and TOEFL. Whereas we have what we might call next-gen tests, relying more on psycholinguistically oriented constructs. So, the bits of language, our ability to process language efficiently, and tasks that are thought to tap into that knowledge. And this would be like the Duolingo English test for the most part, Versant. And we also have some now tests, I think, trying to blend these two approaches, TOEFL Essentials, PTA, and the online version. So we have some notable differences in the constructs of tests being used, in many cases for the same decisions. And so when institutions decide to accept a new test, I've kind of seen two approaches, and this is, again, kind of broad brushes here. They rely on what I think is most of the time equipercentile linking among tests provided, conducted by test providers themselves, tests with many different constructs. A newer test like the DET does some linking study, establishing some concordances with a test like TOEFL. An institution, the people who make the decisions at the institution are going to see, okay, well, our TOEFL score, our minimum score is 61 for conditional admittance. Let's see what that looks like on the DET concordance table. That's it. It's a quick decision. And in defense of institutions in a pandemic, they didn't have a whole lot of time to do a whole lot of research. The other approach, and I think is a little bit more rigorous, is tests are being linked to external frameworks of language ability, like CEFR. And then if an institution has set a admissions threshold, for example, based on one of these external frameworks, like B2, sort of the magic level throughout much of Europe, they can rely on that linking. So at least the decision for a new test is at least based on an institutional standard, not based on a concordance table. So this is, I think, going to be really important to look at going forward with now so many tests being used in several contexts. New concerns, is the information we're getting from several test scores consistent with respect to decisions? Who has the means or access to shop around for test scores that opens the opportunity? Just keep trying out tests till you find something that works. More positively, how might this availability of several different tests in several different configurations at home test center support the opportunity for success for test takers? And then again, I think we should take a hard look at cramming again, look at what people do, not just to cram for one test, but how do they approach that language requirement for whatever decision context they are aiming for. All right, so looking forward, I want to close, or at least introduce a little more optimism. I think we have a lot of opportunity in language testing to enhance fairness. Some of the concerns I've raised about variability in hardware, internet, and home environments might, if not now, ultimately matter less and less. As technology and communications technology continues to advance, mobile technology in particular getting better, faster, more consistent, and then again, more options in theory that should allow test takers to put their best foot forward. And maybe we can, leverage next-gen tests for justice. Again, reducing costs, that's increasing economic access. We might be able to reduce narrow test prep, and sort of lead to more genuine learning as people prepare for tests, which we think is in their best interests. And then thinking, I've talked a lot about admissions testing, but other sorts of decision contexts. For international teaching assistant exams, instead of giving them a test that determines whether they'll actually be able to do the job that their advisor wants them to do when they get on campus, instead of waiting, maybe you can test them beforehand. And that benefits everybody. In terms of migration, we know that sometimes immigration officers are the ones doing the language assessing despite having limited qualifications. Can we take it out of their hands? Can remote testing bring professionals and high quality tests into the migration context? And I want to emphasize only where it is deemed necessary or is unavoidable to test language ability. And then another interesting potential I see is for our multilingual university students. At least in the United States, students can take language tests to earn college credit, get credit for their language abilities. So if they were kind of rock star students in high school, develop higher levels of, say, Spanish proficiency, they can test into higher levels or earn credits, test out even of their language requirements in university. But heritage and multilingual speakers of other languages that are not commonly tested don't get the same benefits. So somebody who speaks Hmong, for example, they don't get to earn 12 credits of language courses in their undergraduate degree because there's no tests to serve their particular repertoires, no available tests. So maybe we can do some good here as well. And last, I want to talk about some challenges moving forward for researchers, I think, interested in fairness and justice. I think we need to expand our focus to ecosystems of test use afforded by policy. As independent researchers, though, we have some hurdles. If we want to access test data, access operational testing systems, and even accessing the test-taking population, these people are far-flung throughout the globe, really, people who might take a remote test. How do we bring them into the fold? Funded research agendas in language testing have been a great source, a great benefit to the field, but just putting myself in their shoes, would proposals for research projects focused on fairness and particularly justice, could those be seen as a risk? This is something potentially challenged. It might be harder to obtain funding for justice-oriented testing work. And then last, bringing policy and institutional stakeholders into it, how do we get larger institutions on board with us, in our little departments, convincing them that these issues really matter? That in a lot of departments at universities, they're happy to look at a concordance table, set a policy in a kind of quick and dirty fashion, and move on. So there was a ILTA webinar on the 15th on this very topic. I haven't caught it live yet. It was in the middle of the night here in Hawaii, but certainly something I'll be tuning into very shortly, learning from some senior colleagues who have experience doing research that brings in institutional stakeholders. So I'll close there. Thank you, everyone. I hope you found this talk to, if not answer all of your questions, at least generate some new ones for you.